The evening I almost lost everything to the person I had spent 33 years raising began like any other January night in Hamilton. I was sitting in the armchair beside the fireplace, Margaret's chair, technically, though I'd stopped thinking of it that way after she passed. The gas fireplace was running, the kind she'd insisted on when we renovated because she said she was too old to stack wood anymore. I hadn't disagreed. I was 63 years old, a retired structural engineer, and my back had opinions about firewood that I'd learned to respect. Outside, the temperature had dropped to -14, the kind of cold that settles into the bones of a city like Hamilton in January and doesn't leave until April. My flight to Fort Lauderdale was at 7 the next morning. My bags were already by the door. I had a cup of tea on the side table, a John Grisham novel in my lap, and absolutely no reason to believe that anything in my life was wrong. That was, I understand now, exactly how it was supposed to feel. The phone rang at 11:42. I looked at the screen and didn't recognize the number. Local area code, but not a contact. I almost let it go to voicemail. I was leaving for the airport in 7 hours, and I had no patience for a telemarketer at that hour, but something made me answer. I couldn't explain it then, and I can't explain it now. Call it instinct. Call it Margaret looking out for me from wherever she'd gone. The voice on the other end was young and careful and clearly nervous in the way that someone is nervous when they're doing something they aren't entirely sure they should be doing. He said his name was Marcus. He said he was a financial advisor at the RBC branch on Upper James, the one where I'd banked for 27 years. He said he was sorry to call so late, and I could tell he meant it, because he apologized 3 times in the first 30 seconds. Then he said something that made me sit forward in Margaret's chair and put down my novel. He said he'd been doing routine evening account reviews, and he'd come across something on my file that he couldn't ignore. I told him to slow down. He did. He took a breath, and then he walked me through it, and by the time he finished, I was no longer thinking about Fort Lauderdale at all. 3 business days earlier, a power of attorney document had been submitted through the Ontario government's online portal, naming my daughter-in-law as my sole legal decision-maker in financial matters. The submission used my date of birth, my SIN, and my home address. I had not submitted it. I had not spoken to a lawyer about it. I had not signed anything. Marcus had flagged it because it appeared in my file through a third-party financial institution inquiry that came through the same day my son had called the bank, asking about the process for converting my GIC holdings into a joint account. There was also, he said quietly, a letter from a physician I had never heard of, a Dr. Ambrose Hartwell, operating out of a medical office in Mississauga, assessing me as showing early signs of cognitive decline and recommending a formal capacity evaluation. The letter was dated November 14th. I had not visited any doctor in Mississauga in November. I had not visited any doctor at all in November, except my own GP, Dr. Patel, for a routine physical she'd declared unremarkable. I sat there in the firelight for a long moment. The Grisham novel had slid off my lap onto the floor. I hadn't noticed. I told him I thought this might be a scam. I told him I wasn't comfortable sharing any personal information over the phone with a number I didn't recognize. He said he'd expected that. He gave me his employee ID in the branch's direct line and told me to hang up, call the RBC main number, ask to be connected to the Upper James branch, and ask for him by name. He said if I didn't want to speak to him again after that, he understood completely, and he was sorry for disturbing my evening. I did exactly that. He answered on the second ring, and his voice sounded the same. Careful, nervous, genuine. I asked him how old he was. He said 29. I asked him how long he'd been at RBC. He said 14 months. I asked him why he was still at the office at 11:40 at night. He said he'd been trying to decide whether to call me since 8 o'clock. He'd looked up my account, seen my flight scheduled through my travel insurance records connected to the account, and realized that if he didn't call before tonight, I would be in Florida by the time the business day started tomorrow. He said he had a daughter who was 8 months old and a mother who lived alone in Scarborough, and he'd thought about what he would want someone to do if it were either of them. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I asked him if he could come to the branch tomorrow morning, early. He said he'd be there at 8. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what I already understood in a part of myself I hadn't wanted to listen to. My son was 34 years old. He worked in commercial real estate, which meant he understood property values and asset transfers and what a paid-off house in a good Hamilton neighborhood was worth. My daughter-in-law worked in HR at a financial services company downtown, which meant she understood paperwork and processes and how systems could be navigated. They'd been after me since Margaret's funeral, to consolidate my finances, to simplify things, to let them help me manage what they called the complexity of my estate. I had smiled and nodded and deflected, the way you do when someone you love is being pushy about something that makes you vaguely uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to confront. I thought about the last time I'd seen them both, at Christmas dinner 3 weeks earlier at their condo in Stony Creek. My daughter-in-law had seemed distracted, checking her phone. My son had brought up the POA 3 times over the course of the evening, framing it differently each time. First, as a practical matter. Then, as something other retired people did routinely. Then, over dessert, as something Margaret would have wanted. That last one had landed, and I'd gone quiet, and he'd backed off. And I'd told myself he was just being thoughtful in an overbearing way, which was how he'd always been. I thought about the cottage in Muskoka. My father had built it in 1971, a 2-bedroom place on a lake 40 minutes north of Huntsville. I'd spent every summer of my childhood there. Margaret and I had spent every summer of our marriage there. My son had grown up there. I had assumed, in the vague way that parents assume things without ever stating them clearly, that one day it would belong to him. Now I lay in the dark and wondered if he had stopped assuming and started taking steps. I called my own lawyer at 8 in the morning. His name was Robert, and I'd used him for wills and property matters for 15 years. I explained what Marcus had told me. There was a short silence, and then Robert said he needed an hour, and he'd call me back. When he called back, his voice had changed. The POA application was real. It had been submitted through the Ontario government's portal using a digital identity verification process. The submission included a scan of what appeared to be my driver's license and a digital signature. Robert said the signature didn't look right to him, but that was something for the police to assess. The physician's letter was also real in the sense that it existed as a document. Whether Dr. Ambrose Hartwell was a genuine physician and whether he had ever actually met me were questions Robert was already looking into. I called the airline and canceled my flight. When I arrived at the branch, Marcus was already there, in a shirt and tie that looked like he'd ironed them carefully that morning. He was younger than I'd imagined, compact, with the kind of quiet steadiness that some young people have and most of them lose by 40. He had a folder of printed documents on the desk in front of him. He stood up when I came in, and he shook my hand, and he thanked me for coming in like I was doing him a favor. I sat across from him, and he walked me through everything again, this time with paper in front of me. The GIC conversion request, the POA submission, the physician's letter, which had come to RBC as part of a package from a company called Clarity Estate Solutions, a firm Marcus had learned that morning that had been incorporated in Ontario 8 months earlier. The registered director of Clarity Estate Solutions was my daughter-in-law's maiden name. I looked at that document for a long time. I had held my daughter-in-law's hand at Margaret's graveside. She had cried, or appeared to. I had felt grateful for her, for the fact that my son had found someone who seemed to genuinely love our family. I had given them $40,000 as a down payment gift when they bought their condo in Stony Creek 4 years ago. I had never once thought about what I was worth to them versus what I was worth to them. Marcus asked if I was all right. I told him I'd been better. He asked me if I wanted him to escalate the matter to RBC's fraud and financial crimes team. He said he wanted to be clear that this was entirely my decision and that he would support whatever I chose to do. He looked at me the way a person looks at someone when they understand that the information they've just delivered has broken something. I told him yes. I told him to escalate everything. Then I drove home and walked through my house like a stranger in it. I went to the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, the one where I kept insurance documents, and the original will and the deed to the cottage. The drawer was slightly open, not enough to notice unless you were looking. 2 files were out of order. The original will was still there. The cottage deed was still there, but the folder containing my GIC certificates, which should have been in alphabetical order between 2 other folders, had been moved to the back of the drawer. I went to the front hallway and pulled up the footage on my Ring doorbell. My son had been the one who'd helped me install it 2 years earlier after a string of package thefts in the neighborhood. He knew it was there. He also knew, or thought he knew, that I didn't review the footage unless something happened at the front door. He was wrong about that. Margaret had been the one who reviewed it, obsessively, because she'd been convinced the neighbor's teenager was letting their dog do its business on our front lawn. She'd never caught him. But she'd shown me where the recordings were stored, and I'd kept the subscription going after she died because it felt like keeping a small piece of her routine intact. I went back 3 weeks. There it was, December 29th, 10:15 at night. My son and daughter-in-law, letting themselves in with the spare key I'd given them years ago. They were inside for 41 minutes. When they came out, my daughter-in-law had a tote bag. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the paused frame of them walking out my front door, and I felt something close. It was grief, the kind that has a very specific texture, not the sharp grief of losing Margaret, but the dull, waterlogged grief of realizing that a version of your life you believed in never actually existed. My son had sat at this kitchen table for 33 years. He'd eaten his cereal here before school. He'd done his homework here. Margaret and I had paid for his university from this table, transferring money on a laptop because the internet had finally made that possible. I had given him my father's watch on his wedding day, standing in this kitchen because there hadn't been a better moment. He had stood in this same kitchen 8 days ago at 10 o'clock at night, while I was asleep in the hotel in Ottawa, where I'd gone to visit an old university friend, and he had gone through my files. I called Robert again. Over the next 10 days, the picture became fully clear. Dr. Ambrose Hartwell did exist. He was a geriatric physician in Mississauga with a legitimate practice. But he had never met me. He had never assessed me. The letter bearing his name had been created using a template pulled from an Ontario Health Authority website, and the signature was either forged or produced by someone with access to a digital copy of his signature. Robert's contact at the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons confirmed that Dr. Hartwell had filed a complaint about identity fraud the previous week after being alerted by another client's family that a letter claiming to be from him had surfaced in an unrelated case. My son and my daughter-in-law were not the only ones who had used Clarity Estate Solutions. There were at least 2 other elderly clients in the Greater Toronto area whose families had engaged the company. The Hamilton Police Service Financial Crimes Unit became involved. A detective named Sergeant Bouchard, a quiet woman in her 40s with the kind of face that gave nothing away, came to my house on a Tuesday morning and sat at my kitchen table and asked me careful, methodical questions for 2 hours. She asked me not to contact my son or daughter-in-law until she told me it was appropriate. She said she appreciated my patience. I was patient. I was 63 years old and I had been an engineer, which meant I understood that the most important part of any structure was its foundation, and that the correct response to discovering a flaw was methodical assessment, not panic. I drank a great deal of tea that week. I called my GP and told her what was happening because I thought she ought to know, given that a fraudulent document had been generated in the professional sphere she occupied. She was, to put it mildly, appalled. My son called me twice that week. I answered both times, because Sergeant Bouchard had asked me to maintain normal communication. He asked if I was feeling all right, if the Florida trip had been canceled for health reasons, if there was anything he could do. His voice was smooth and even, and I thought about the way it had sounded at Margaret's funeral, broken open in a way I'd assumed was real. Maybe some of it had been. That's the complicated thing about people. They are rarely entirely one thing. On the 14th day, Sergeant Bouchard called me in the morning and told me charges had been laid. My son and daughter-in-law were each charged with fraud over $5,000, uttering a forged document, and unauthorized use of a computer. That last charge relating to the digital identity verification that had been manipulated to file the fraudulent POA. My daughter-in-law faced an additional charge related to the incorporation of Clarity Estate Solutions and its use as an instrument of fraud against multiple victims. I was in my kitchen when Sergeant Bouchard told me, and I looked out the window at the backyard, at Margaret's garden, which I'd let get overgrown because I couldn't bring myself to pull out the plants she'd put in the ground with her own hands. The sky was the flat white of a Hamilton January. 2 sparrows were sitting on the fence, doing nothing in particular. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat there for a while. Then I drove to RBC. Marcus was with a client when I arrived, but the branch manager came and got him when I explained why I was there. He came out looking mildly alarmed, the way people do when they're called out of a meeting unexpectedly. I asked if we could go somewhere private. He brought me to a small meeting room in the back. I told him I needed to transfer some money. He looked at me carefully, the instinctive professional wariness of someone whose job involves detecting unusual transaction behavior. I told him it was legitimate. I told him I wanted to transfer $80,000 CAD to an account in his name as a personal gift. He stared at me. I told him there was no tax obligation for him. Canada doesn't tax personal gifts. He knew that better than I did. I told him I'd spoken to Robert, my lawyer, and the transfer was fully documented and above board. I told him that $80,000 was a number I'd arrived at by thinking about what it cost, in time and worry and potential professional risk, to call a stranger at 11:40 at night on a matter that wasn't technically your job, and that number felt low to me, but I didn't know how to make it higher without it becoming something other than gratitude. He shook his head slowly. He started to say something about just doing his job. I told him his job was to process financial transactions and answer questions about interest rates, and that calling clients at midnight was not listed anywhere in that job description, and that he and I both knew it. I told him he'd flown driven, actually. He'd driven to the branch at 8 in the morning, on what was technically his flex day, and he'd sat across from a frightened old man, with a folder of evidence he'd assembled on his own time, and he'd handled it with more grace and steadiness than most people twice his age would have managed. I told him his daughter would be starting school in 5 years, and that I had set up an RESP in her name. I'd gotten the information from his HR file, with the branch manager's assistance and his blessing, and that there was $30,000 already deposited into it, with a standing annual contribution of $5,000 for the next 10 years. He looked at me for a moment like he was deciding whether to say something or not. Then he said, "My mom's been having a hard time. She's renting in Scarborough, and the rent keeps going up. And I've been trying to help her, but it's—" He stopped. I already knew about his mother, I'd asked, during one of our follow-up conversations over the past 2 weeks, because it had seemed relevant. She was 57 years old, a nurse at Scarborough Health Network, recently divorced, renting a 2-bedroom apartment because she hadn't been able to afford to buy after the marriage ended. I told him that I had also, with Robert's help, placed $120,000 in trust, designated as a property purchase gift for his mother, conditional on it being used toward a home in the Greater Toronto Area within the next 3 years, with no obligation to repay. He put his hand over his mouth. I told him I had one more thing. I told him that Margaret and I had spent 41 summers at the cottage in Muskoka, and that it was the best place I had ever been on earth, and that I intended to keep it for the rest of my life, but that I had room in my heart for it to be loved by people other than just me. I told him that the cottage was his family's to use for 2 weeks every August, for as long as he wanted it, with the boat and the canoe and whatever fishing gear he needed, and that I had put this in writing with Robert. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I don't know what to say." I said, "Say you'll teach your daughter to fish." He laughed. It was the laugh of someone releasing something they'd been holding for a long time. He was 29 years old, and he had a daughter who was 8 months old, and a mother who was struggling, and he had chosen to stay late at the office and agonize for 3 hours about whether to make a phone call that turned out to matter more than either of us could have known when he finally dialed the number. I drove home along the escarpment. Hamilton was gray and cold below me, and the lake was a flat, pewter line at the edge of the sky. I had lived in this city for 40 years. Margaret had loved it, which was the main reason I'd stayed after the engineering firm relocated to Mississauga, and I'd had to commute for 6 years rather than uproot her from the garden. She'd been right to love it. Cities have a texture that takes decades to learn, and I had learned this one, and it was mine even when it was cold and gray and uninspiring. The legal process took 11 months. My son pleaded guilty to fraud over $5,000 and received a conditional sentence 2 years in the community, with strict conditions including financial probation, meaning he could not hold a position involving financial decision-making authority during that period. My daughter-in-law, facing the heavier charges related to Clarity Estate Solutions and the multiple victims it had defrauded, received an 18-month conditional sentence and a significant fine. Neither of them went to prison, which was the outcome Robert had said was most likely given their lack of prior criminal records and the Canadian sentencing framework for first-time nonviolent financial offenders. I had come to peace with that. The criminal record was enough. What I cared about was the legal architecture of my own life, which I rebuilt carefully with Robert over the months that followed. I removed my son entirely from my will. This was not a decision I made in anger. I made it the way I made structural decisions in my career, by looking at what was load-bearing and what was not, by identifying where the stress fractures were, by being honest about what could be reinforced and what couldn't. The relationship between my son and me had fractured along a line I hadn't seen, which meant it had been there for a long time, growing quietly. Perhaps I'd missed it because I'd been busy. Perhaps I'd missed it because I'd wanted to miss it. The estate went to 3 organizations: a cancer research fund at McMaster University Hospital in Margaret's name, an engineering scholarship for first-generation students, and a land conservancy that protected wetland in the Muskokas. There was one provision that Robert raised an eyebrow at, and then helped me draft without further comment. It stated that Marcus, his full name, his address, his daughter's name, was to have access to the cottage in perpetuity for 2 weeks in August, until his daughter was old enough to decide for herself whether she wanted it. I thought Margaret would have approved of that particular clause. She had always said the best thing about the cottage was that it made people slow down long enough to remember what mattered. She wasn't wrong about much. I rebooked my Fort Lauderdale flight for February. I walked through the airport with my carry-on and my paperback and my boarding pass, and I felt the specific lightness of a person who has had something lifted from them, not grief exactly, because grief doesn't leave, but the particular heaviness of not knowing. I knew now. I knew what had been built around me and what it had been worth, and I knew what was real and what had been performance, and that knowledge, however painful, was something I could stand on. An older couple were sitting across from me at the gate, sharing a sandwich from a Tim Hortons bag. They were bickering gently about the window seat. The woman won. The man looked pleased about it. I thought about Margaret until the boarding announcement came. There are things I won't recover from. The way my son looked at me at Margaret's graveside, I will never know, now, how much of that was real. The Christmases, the birthday calls, the times he sat at the kitchen table and ate my cooking and talked about his future. Some of it was real. I believe that. I have to believe some of it was real, because the alternative is a loneliness so complete I'm not sure I could live inside it. So I choose to believe that the boy who came before the man is someone I actually knew, and the man who made the choices he made is someone I have said goodbye to. Marcus sends me photos from the cottage every August. His daughter is 3 now, old enough to wear a life jacket, and sit in the bow of the canoe and drag her hands in the water. In the most recent photo he sent, she is looking at a frog on a rock, with an expression of such complete, astonished wonder that it made me laugh out loud in my kitchen, alone, and feel something I don't have a precise word for, close to glad, close to whole. I'm 64 years old. I live in a condo now, downtown Hamilton, 6 blocks from the waterfront. The garden is gone. I couldn't maintain it, and I couldn't bear to let it go badly. So in the end, I let it go cleanly, which is another thing Margaret was right about without knowing it. The view from the balcony is the escarpment and the lake, and in the morning the light comes in at an angle that makes the whole city look briefly like somewhere worth everything. I have coffee. I have the newspaper. I have my health, which I don't take lightly anymore. I have the number of a 29-year-old financial advisor saved in my contacts, 30 now, actually. His birthday was in October, who answered a phone at 8 in the morning on his day off, and sat across from a frightened old man with a folder of evidence and the steadiness of someone twice his age. I don't think about the flight I didn't take. I think, sometimes, about the phone that rang when it could have gone to voicemail. I think about the exact weight of that particular choice, and what it would have cost both of us if he'd made a different one. I try to make the same kind of choices when they come up for me. I'm not always successful, but I try. Margaret would have liked Marcus, I think. She had a way of recognizing people who were fundamentally decent, a radar for it, finely tuned over decades of paying attention, and she would have known within 5 minutes of meeting him that he was one of the good ones. She would have asked about his daughter. She would have been glad about the cottage. I'm glad about it too. Most mornings, that's enough.